In a small, quaint village nestled between rolling hills and a sparkling river, there lived a young man named Fred. Fred was known for his good heart, sharp wit, and terrible memory. He was always cheerful, even when things went wrong, which was often. One sunny morning, Fred woke up with a slight headache. He decided it was finally time to visit Dr. Jenkins, the village doctor, who was famous for his peculiar methods and unconventional remedies. Fred walked into the clinic, where Dr. Jenkins was busy scribbling something in his notebook. The doctor looked up and greeted Fred with a warm smile. "Good morning, Fred. What brings you here today?" "Good morning, Doc. I've got this headache that just won't go away," Fred replied, rubbing his temples for dramatic effect. Dr. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, let me ask you a few questions. Do you exercise regularly?" Fred scratched his head. "I'm not sure, Doc. Is chasing after chickens considered exercise?" Dr. Jenkins chuckled. "Not quite, Fred. What about your diet? Do you eat lots of vegetables?" Fred thought for a moment. "Well, there's lettuce on my burger." "Does that count?" Dr. Jenkins laughed. "All right, Fred, let's try a different approach. I want you to go home, lie down, and think about something very boring. That should help with the headache." Fred nodded eagerly. "Okay, Doc, I'll give it a try." On his way home, Fred passed by the village bakery, where the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. He decided to stop in for a quick snack, completely forgetting about his headache and the doctor's advice. Inside, he saw Mrs. Thompson, the baker, kneading dough with her usual enthusiasm. "Good morning, Fred. How are you today?" "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. I just went to see Dr. Jenkins about a headache, but now all I can think about is your delicious bread," Fred exclaimed. Mrs. Thompson laughed. "Well, bread can be very distracting, but I hope you remember to follow the doctor's orders." Fred grinned sheepishly. "Right, the doctor. I almost forgot." After grabbing a loaf of bread, Fred continued his journey home. As he walked, he bumped into his friend Sam, who was fishing by the river. "Hey, Fred. What are you up to?" Sam called out. Fred scratched his head. "I'm not sure. I went to the doctor for something, but now I can't remember what it was." Sam chuckled. "Knowing you, Fred, it was probably nothing serious. Want to join me for some fishing?" Fred agreed and sat down next to Sam, completely forgetting about the doctor, the headache, and the boring thoughts he was supposed to have. A few hours later, Fred finally made it back home. As he lay down on his bed, he suddenly remembered the doctor's advice. He decided to think about something boring. "What's the most boring thing I can think of?" he wondered. After a few moments, Fred had an idea. "Oh, I know. I'll think about the time the council discussed the new fence around the village square. That was the longest meeting ever." Fred closed his eyes and began to replay the meeting in his mind. Slowly but surely, his headache began to fade. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, thinking, maybe the doctor's advice wasn't so strange after all. The next morning, Fred felt as good as new. He walked back to Dr. Jenkins' clinic to thank him. "Good morning, Fred. How are you feeling today?" the doctor asked. Fred beamed. "I feel great, Doc. Your advice worked like a charm." Dr. Jenkins smiled. "I'm glad to hear it, Fred. Remember, sometimes the best cure is just a little bit of rest and a whole lot of boring thoughts." Fred nodded. "I'll keep that in mind, Doc. But next time, could you make the cure involve bread? That's way more interesting." Dr. Jenkins laughed heartily. "We'll see what we can do, Fred. We'll see what we can do." And with that, Fred walked out of the clinic, ready for another day of adventures in the village, knowing that whatever came his way, he could handle it with a smile and a good loaf of bread.